So, hey, for those of you who are there in virtual land, welcome to this Charlotte Readers Live, a production of Charlotte Readers Podcast, where authors give voice to the written words. I'm Landis Wade, the host of the podcast. Recovering trial lawyer, write a few lighthearted legal thrillers. My latest is Deadly Declarations. I'm here today with Nora Gaskin. Nora, raise your hand there. Say hello. There you go.
Hi, everybody.
Nora is an author and an editor. More about her in just a moment, but I should say that Nora is also been my developmental editor, and I'm very happy for that, for all 4 of my books. And so that sparked us to this idea of having a conversation about developmental editing. And that's the topic for tonight. We're doing novel developmental editing. And so Nora and I are going to talk about 3 things tonight. First of all, thank you for joining us and spending some of your valuable time with us tonight. We're going to talk about the developmental editing process, number 1. That's one editor's approach to that. Number 2, we're going to, because I like things in 3, so we're doing a 3 thing here today. So number 2 is examples of developmental editing from my novel, Deadly Declarations, and from Nora's latest novel, The Worst Thing. And then we're going to wrap it up with tips for how authors and developmental editors can work together, with me sharing my tips as an author and Nora sharing her tips as a developmental editor, and how we didn't kill each other through 4 books and so forth. But first, let's meet Nora. Nora, tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and as both a writer and an editor.
Thanks, Landis, and thanks very much for inviting me to do this. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I personally have published I have 3 published books, 2 novels, Until Proven and The Worst Thing, and a nonfiction book, Time of Death. I have bachelor's and master's degrees in English. My career path veered off for 25 years, and then I came back to my first loves, which are writing, literature, words, and storytelling. I'm a lifelong reader. I always have more than 1 book going at a time, and these days I usually have an audiobook going as well, and I'm sure a lot of people who are listening in relate to that. I began my editing work almost by accident, in that until I began doing it, I didn't know how much I would love it or that I would turn out to be good at it. I've been in critique groups for years, and writing groups, good groups that function well together. The members are very supportive of each other, but also poking and prodding each other to improve, to be better writers, to study craft, to tell that story the best way you possibly can, and really to grow as writers. So that experience, plus many years of reading books about craft, which I love, and taking classes and seminars on writing, all of that became my springboard into editing. Then the editing resulted in the creation of a very small, non-traditional publishing company, Listra Books. Listra Books has now published more than 30 books, and that's in less than 10 years. So I'm very proud of that. And I'm very proud, Landis, that your 4 books are on that list. Yeah. I think it's been a great working relationship.
It really has. Thank you for that. No, I'm proud to have all 4 books with Listra. I sometimes pronounce it Lystra. Whatever. It's
okay.
It's okay. I thought it was funny, Nora, you mentioned that your career path veered off for 25 years. Mine veered off for 35 years. I think those are basically veering off so you can earn a living before you come back to doing the things that you can't necessarily always earn a living at. So
that's it.
Yeah. So okay. Well, yeah. So Nora mentioned that I had 4 books with her tutelage, and it started with my Christmas series, where lawyers save Christmas, kind of a cross between My Cousin Vinny and Miracle on 34th Street. And I didn't know when I wrote the first book whether there'd be another one, but she kept encouraging me there, and we got those 3 out. And then I took about a 3-year break. I wasn't really a break. I've been podcasting for 3 years and interviewing authors and learning more about writing, and that led to the latest novel. But before I mention that, we've got the 2 novels, our recent novels, that we're going to use kind of as a foundation for this discussion. So we're just going to very briefly tell the viewers here what each of those books are about, because we're going to be mentioning them throughout the show today. So Nora, tell us about The Worst Thing, which I've read and enjoyed.
Thank you. Yeah, The Worst Thing gets its title from an event in the life of its main character, Kella Mace, When Kella was 15, her parents were both killed in a freak accident. At their funeral, she overhears someone say, well, now she knows the worst thing that could ever happen in her life has already happened. And once I came up with that scenario, it led me to two questions. One is, if you believed that, if someone believed that, if they believe that the worst thing that could possibly happen to them has already happened, then how would they lead their lives? And then the second question was, what if she was wrong? What if the worst thing had not happened yet? So it's the possibility that there was something even worse to come that kicks the story off. It's a suspense book. We know there's a bad guy. Who he is not a secret. So it's not a mystery. It is suspense, because then the issue becomes, can they catch him and can they stop him?
Yeah, it has a little bit of that Silence of the Lambs feel early on when I was thinking about as I was reading this this evildoer here. You know he's a bad guy right off the bat, and you're hoping that the protagonist can stay away from him. All right, so just quickly, Deadly Decorations. It's a lighthearted legal thriller. It's my recent novel. It's set in Charlotte, where an unlikely trio of retirees get together and try to solve two mysteries. One, there's a 96-year-old resident who's died, and he's when they find his body, his manuscript on the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence is missing, and he's left a handwritten will and his $50 million fortune to the most despised resident at the Indy, Sue Ellen Parker, and cut his beloved granddaughter out of the will. And so we have a little situation here where a fellow named Craig Travail, who's a 65-year-old lawyer down. I'm about 65. I'm not really that guy, but I didn't tackle my managing partner on the way out of the law firm like he did. But anyway, he ends up in a retirement community, and he's lost his wife. He doesn't want to be there, and he thinks retirement is for people who are there to die, not live. And so he's kind of on his heels. But he meets two interesting characters. One rather eccentric, Chuck Yeager Alexander. He's kind of a conspiracy theorist, and then Harriet Keaton, who keeps the men in line. She's a former businesswoman. They encourage him to challenge the will, to try to help the beloved granddaughter. And when that happens and they go to court, clues start to surface, and it becomes apparent that somebody wants to keep the secret of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. And if they're not careful, they may solve the mystery. That is, if they don't die trying. So mine's kind of a little mystery, a little suspense, a little run for your life toward the end of the book. But altogether, Nora helped me, pare it down, and we're going to use these two novels for our discussion today. So, I thought, Nora, we would start out by just talking about. And by the way, let me just tell everyone, when I first got into this, I was referred to Nora by John Buchan, one of my law partners. She had helped him with, I think, the paperback of his book, Code of the Forest, which was a great book. And I was asking John, where do I go? What do I do? I've got this story. And so he sent me to Nora, and therein began my journey of trying to learn how to work with an editor. And I will tell you, the viewers, that Nora recently told me that her job is not to make me comfortable. So that's one thing that to develop. You want to say anything about that, Nora?
We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. All right. Okay. So I got into this, and I didn't know what the difference was between developmental editing and any other kind of editing. And we're at the stage now, and we're going to talk with Nora about her process in this first phase of the discussion today. That is, one editor's approach in the developmental editing process. And it might, before I start leading you into some of these thoughts, Nora, it might help to sort of ground ourselves to talk about the difference between developmental editing and the copy editing stage of the process, so we can make sure we're clear about what we're doing today.
Sure, you're right. That's a good place to start. Developmental editing, which is what I do, focuses pretty much on the big picture things in a manuscript: plot development, character development. And I'll say I edit fiction and creative nonfiction. And even in memoir, creative nonfiction, you might say, well, these are not characters. This is not a plot. This is somebody's life story. But as it comes through on the page, to engage with the reader and carry the reader forward, I think that good memoir, good creative nonfiction uses many of the same devices for character development and plot development that fiction does. So I'm looking at those. I'm paying very close attention to the timeline. That's something you and I have gone back and forth on, Landis. I have a strong belief that the reader needs to be always grounded in time. The reader always needs to know where they are, but also when they are and how time is passing. I look at the plausibility. I look at continuity. Simple example, if the character has brown eyes on page 10 and blue eyes on page 200, there's a problem with the continuity. So I'm looking for those sorts of things.
Or if they order a glass of tea and the waiter brings it to the table, and then a few seconds later they're pouring a glass of water for each other, you got to pick that up.
Yes. Close to home there, Landis.
Exactly. That happened in one of the books.
I pay a lot of attention to the point of view that a writer uses to tell the story, and I pay close attention to the structure, which for me is the answer to the questions: what does the reader know, and when does she know it? What does the reader know, and when does she know it? Or I might even say, when does she need to know it? Because that's going to key the writer into when and how they want to release information to the reader.
Yeah.
So these are big picture items, but they can very often rest on tiny details. So while I'm looking at the big picture, I often say nothing is too small for me to consider.
Yeah. And the difference then between that and something later in the process is you're looking more for punctuation, for whether you're following a style book consistently, for
right.
whether or not you've got any misspellings. This is more of a copy editing stage.
The copy editor will go through looking for consistency and punctuation. People probably know or would quickly find out if they start looking into these things. You may have two authorities on punctuation that disagree with each other. Mm-hmm. So you could argue, well, there's no right or wrong, but the key to looking professional, to coming across as a professionally edited manuscript, is to be consistent. So you're using the same set of rules, even if there's a different set. You pick one and stay with it. A copy editor is going to take care of that. Certainly misspellings, typos. We'll think about, also we'll often do some fact checking, and that can be an important thing. Memory is tricky, and we think we remember that a world shaking event occurred in 1973. And if we would stop and Google it, we would find out it was 1974. And some of our readers are going to know that, and they're going to catch us out, and then you've lost a reader. So that fact checking also comes into play at that more detailed level, and is very important. And the copy editor I work with does a lot of that.
Yeah. So that's all good. And we're going to talk more about this, and we're going to put it in the context of some experiences that we've had together working on this book. And while we say that, there are certain rules in writing, there are also certain rules to be broken in writing. But consistency is a theme I think that you bring to the table in what we do together. And so from your perspective, let's just carry this a little bit further, because you deal with a lot of different kinds of writers. I mean, some writers perhaps are more lyrical than others. Some writers like to write in first person. Some writers like to write in third person. Some writers are more, they like more dialogue. They like, that kind of thing. So when you're dealing with different kinds of writers who have different strengths and weaknesses, how do you approach that situation?
Great question. I respect the writer I try to meet them where they are, and I respect those differences. One writer A, may be very strong in developing character and plot, whereas writer B is much stronger on atmosphere and the lyricism that you mentioned. So my job is not to change them or to homogenize them so that they come out sounding alike or that they come out sounding like me, but my job is to try to meet them where they are and help them recognize their strengths and their weaknesses, and try to complement themselves and complete themselves as writers to to bring the background stuff forward, maybe to let what they naturally bring to the foreground, maybe let that settle back a little bit and try to achieve some balance in those manuscripts and never change the author's authentic voice.
Yeah, and one of the things that just sparked a memory for me, but I mean, I think my strengths are more in the area of kind of plotting and character development, maybe some dialogue, but I have a harder time sometimes with the five senses and also maybe what's going on around me. And you do a good job of, I remember in the manuscript reminding me of things like Landis. Okay, what else is going on in the courtroom? You know, where are these other characters when I'm writing a courtroom scene? Because I might get tunnel vision focused on, you know, the lawyer's asking the question and the witness on the stand. And those are good thoughts. And also, you know, what does it taste like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like in this particular environment here? So those are things that I think a developmental editor. Do you want to say anything about that? Because I think it's an important thing to bring richness to the page. Yeah.
Yes, and a lesson I learned, my mentor back when I was at UNC as an undergraduate, my mentor was a wonderful teacher named Max Steele, wonderful writing teacher. And Max taught us always tell what people eat, because food brings all the senses into a scene. It has aromas, it has texture, it has maybe it's crunchy, it even has sound. So the food is going to bring in all of the senses, and it tells you so much about character and about maybe their socioeconomic class. And the reader will pick up on that without you having to hammer home. So you want the richness of that background stuff. I think you could make some of the same arguments for telling what people wear. That it's going to not so much bring all the senses, but it's going to give the reader something to really quickly identify certain characteristics about the characters in the book. So look for those things.
Yeah, and also one of my strengths is not describing every flower, every crevice in somebody's face or that kind of thing, but I think there's some value to leaving a little bit to the reader's imagination when it comes to those situations, right?
I agree, but I think you can trigger the imagination.
Sure, absolutely. All right, so you say you take the writers where they are, that not all are the same, but you do have some preferences when it comes to things like, that is, you don't want to affect their voice, right? You want the voice of the writer to come through. But, you know, you and I have a lot of discussions about tense. Now, I write in third person. We talk about not tense so much, but point of view in that tense.
Right.
But you have some preferences when it comes to tense, right?
Yes, verb tense. I find that present tense is difficult. Somewhere along the line, over the many, many centuries that human beings have been telling each other stories or writing stories for someone else to read, we fell into a habit that I think we all have, of accepting the simple past tense as being the real time in most books. In most books, simple past tense conveys the real time of the action. So when somebody writes in present tense, because they are going to also have that simple past so deeply ingrained in them, they're going to slip up. Most writers I've encountered who try to write in present tense are going to slip up. They're not going to do it very well or very consistently. Now, it so happens some of the finest books I know have been written in present tense, but those are coming from very skilled and very experienced writers. So I encourage people who are starting out to make life easier on themselves by not going into present tense. And sometimes, you know, I open a manuscript to get started and I see they're using present tense and I'm going, uh-oh. But if they can carry it off, great. Anybody who can, anything you can get away with is fine with me, but you're going to have to get away with it. That's a little bit of a red flag for me. I'm going to ask people, I'm going to hold their feet to the fire. I'm going to say, what is the rationale for this? Why is this story best told this way? Have you tried it in past tense? Well, give it a try and see if it flows for you. So I'm going to push back a little bit on something like that. It's not just a personal preference. It may be a personal preference, but it's not just a personal preference. It's also from experience that that can be a tough thing to pull off. And why spend energy there? Spend that creative energy telling the story better rather than fighting with yourself to keep something in present tense.
Yeah, there's the value, there's a certain immediacy that comes with present tense if you can pull it off, that particularly if you're writing a thriller or something like that. But also it can handicap you a little bit too, in terms of what you can do if you're always going to have to be in the present in whoever's point of view you are at the time. So, well, let's talk about the editing process a little bit, and then your formula that you usually remind me of every time we get into this book developmental editing process. But in terms of your process, when I or some other writer sends you their manuscript, which hopefully isn't the first draft, but is one that the author has gone over 2 or 3 times, maybe gotten a little bit of feedback ahead of time and done a little paring down. What's your first step when you get that document?
The first thing I do is read through it pretty quickly, pretty much the way any reader is going to read through a book. So just now I may do it in a shorter or more compressed period of time than I do when I pick up a book to read just for pleasure, but I'm just going to try to go through it fairly quickly, approaching it as any reader would. And that, number one, gives me an overview for the book. So then I have the whole story in mind. I have the whole arc in mind. But it also enables me to think a little bit about what is the reader going to be needing. I'll go back to my questions. What does the reader know, and when do they know it? I'm looking for that, maybe above all, when I give it that first reading. Then my second reading is very slow and deep. It moves back and forth. I may, after I've read chapter 10, I may need to go back and reread chapter 3. So I go back and forth. Then I'm making a lot of notes for myself. I'm also making a lot of notes for the reader, I'm making a lot of notes for the writer on the page that they're going to get back from me on the manuscript itself. So they're going to get back a manuscript that is really marked up. Lots of comments, lots of suggestions, lots of why now? Sometimes the comment is a very, I will say, maybe it's a little hostile sounding, so what? Or, huh? So that all goes into the comments that the writer is going to get back from me. But again, I'm looking for all those big picture things.
Which gets back to the earlier comment about not wanting to necessarily make me feel comfortable, right? So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly.
And so what I do when we're going to talk a little bit more about how Nora and our exchange back and forth in the novel Deadly Declarations in a moment. But I can tell you that after each time I'd get some material back, I'd just have to read it and then set it aside for 2 or 3 days and then come back to it. So I would kind of cool down a little bit and then sort of think through logically and not emotionally, what was on the page there. So we'll come back to that in a second. But before we get there, let's talk about your formula for rewriting, because that comes into your process in terms of both the notes you provide and some of the track changes you provide in that first, feedback.
It sure does. And I picked this up from a writer some years back, and I have always regretted that I didn't jot down who that writer was, because I would love to give that person credit. I comfort myself by thinking, well, they probably got it from somebody else anyway, so who knows where these things originate. But the formula is for rewriting and self-editing, and it is add, subtract, reorder, and clarify. And when I heard that formula, I knew for me, it was right. It allows me to organize my own thoughts about a manuscript in those categories. What should be added? What should be subtracted, which is another way of saying deleted. And no writer likes the word delete. What can be reordered, getting back to what does the reader know and when do they know it? And clarify, which in many cases means simplify. Not always. Sometimes you need to explain it a little bit more, but very often An idea becomes clearer when you just pare away the extra and let that idea stand there. That will clarify it. So I preach to use this formula, to writers, use this formula to help you in your rewriting process or in your self-editing process. It'll help you to organize your own thoughts. And I think it gives the writer some distance from their work. We can't, one of the big barriers for any of us in self-editing is we fall in love with what we've said on the page, and we will defend it at all costs. And that's why Faulkner said the writers must kill their little darlings. We've got to do that. And I think that to do that, you have to get some distance. You have to be able to read your work as if somebody else wrote it. And I think just having those 4 categories or having that formula can really help you gain that distance from the work to do your own self-editing.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. Those 4: add, subtract, reorder, and clarify. And I would say to writers who are watching this, you might have disagreements perhaps from time to time about what to add, what to subtract, and how to reorder if you're working with a developmental editor. But if your developmental editor tells you something needs to be clarified, you know, that probably is a sign that you need to do something, because if the reader doesn't get it, then it's not the reader's fault, it's the writer's fault. At least that's what I subscribe to. So anytime I get a clarify comment, I'm looking very closely at that. The others are all great feedback, and we'll talk more about that as we get into some examples here. But if you think about it, when you're adding, you might be adding texture and richness, like I talked about the 5 senses. What else is going on around these characters? Or it might be you need a little more dialogue here, or subtracting. You got too much dialogue here. It reads like, there's a whole page of dialogue before anything else happens. Or you've got too much, like I had in my Deadly Declarations, too much history here when everybody's supposed to be running for their lives, at the end. So we got to pare some of that down. That's subtracting. So that's all good stuff. I think I want to shift to this idea of when you get this feedback. Nora, you and I've had this, and you talk about this, and I want to just dive into it right now. The third way, because
Mm-hmm.
it's come about a lot in you and I working together, because
Mm-hmm.
it's maybe we don't agree. We agree on a lot, most of the stuff, but there's times we don't agree on different things, and yet through that process, we get this third way. Talk about that a second.
Sure. And I tell writers I'm working with sometimes that when I question something you've written, don't defend it, and don't look for the ways that I am wrong. And I will, likewise, I will not try to defend my point of view. Let's push past that and look for the third way. And it's, a writer may express something in a way I just don't like at all. I just think, well, that's just not good. And maybe I see a way to redo it. And maybe I offer them a few sentences of my own. Well, what if you said it this way? What if you said it that way? So I offer them some examples, and they just hate what I offer. They don't like what I did at all. If the writer can then reopen his or her imagination to their own work, if they can realize that nothing is set in stone here, and be willing to reimagine it and rethink it, then they're going to come up with something else, that third way, not the original, not mine, but the third way. And just inevitably, it is better than either of the others. And on some occasions, I go, okay, let's look for a fourth way. But usually that third way is what works. And people just have to be prompted to reopen their thoughts about the book, reopen their own imagination to the situation they've created, and find the better way, better than either what they'd come up with or what I've come up with.
Yeah, and that's happened a number of times in the 4 books we've worked on, because writing and rewriting is a process. So, just because I send you draft number 5 and you find something in it that doesn't please your editorial situation at the time, I need to remember this is only draft 5, and
That's right.
maybe I don't agree necessarily with what Nora said, but I should take a close look at this, because maybe something's not fitting here or fitting with the whole narrative, and maybe that's why. And so I think there was one uh, chapter you didn't like for some reason, and I looked at it more closely, and you know, I think part of the point was it was dragging down the narrative, and yet I still wanted to have that. I think it was the Liberty Walk uptown or something we did in the
Hmm.
daily declarations,
Hmm.
but I still wanted to have that feature there because it's a local book. It'll kind of give people. So, but what I did was I significantly pared down what happened in that scene to still have the Liberty Walk and yet not go off into like a whole history lesson, you know, about that. And I think that was your point, and we ended up with a different way to kind of keep the pace, you know, moving at that part. So, all right, before we jump into the examples, other examples, how we work together, any thoughts on I know you've already said you're not all things to all people, that kind of thing. You take the writers they come, but what's your goal primarily, Nora, when you take on a task like this, developmental editing?
It's to make the story better, to see if what I can bring to the process that will make the story better. I'm just all about the story, and that's why I am willing to not to cater to the writer's ego. I am willing to be annoying. I am willing to, if you put my face on your dartboard, that's okay with me. Um, that's that's what I consider to be doing my job, because it's about the story and tell a good story in the best way you possibly can. And
Right.
that's what I hope to bring to the process. If there's a writer who doesn't feel my approach will do that for them, then we will part company on friendly terms, and everybody will go on and to do better things. But that's always my goal, to make the story better.
All right. Well, let's do this. We're going to talk about how we work together on deadly declarations, and then you're going to talk about a few things in your own developmental editing process for the worst thing. But just to lead into this, I should share that because you're a busy person and you had some other commitments, when I was ready to send you the initial manuscript, you were tied up editing some other things. So I took the opportunity to send it out to some beta readers, got some feedback. And so I had the chance to actually, before I sent you a manuscript this time, to have it gone through several other eyes, you know, regular readers, a couple of mystery writers, and that kind of thing, which really, I think, it cut down on of the four things we mentioned on the reordering. We didn't have as much reordering to do this time around, but we did still deal with add, subtract, and clarify. Um, and so here's kind of how it went, as I recall, and you can share what you think. But you got the manuscript. You gave me 5 pages, double spaced, of editorial comments and some track change comments in the manuscript itself. And I let that sit over here and simmer for a few days, and then I did. It wasn't that I'm defending, but I had to put my thoughts on paper so you'd know why I did certain things. And so I drafted up this 6 page response, single space. Right? You gave me 4 pages, 5 pages double space. I gave you 6 single space.
Yeah.
But what I did was I kind of broke it down, and what I did was there were 8 areas that we agreed on. I put 4 areas where we mostly agree, and 1 area where we partially agreed, and 9 areas where we disagreed. But I put down my thoughts, and then there was another area where I had several questions about your questions that you had raised. Um, all of which led us to have a conversation, which I thought was very productive because we sat down and we both had these pieces of paper and we could both see, and then we just kind of talked through that process, your thoughts, my thoughts. And I think through that, I realized some things through the conversation that weren't clear to me in your notes, and you realized some things in our conversation that weren't clear in my notes, and maybe you understood some of my thoughts. I understood better some of your thoughts going in around two. Is that kind of how you remember it? Yeah.
Yes, and I do smile a little when I remember that you sent me back more comments than I had sent you in the first place. So
It's like, there you go. You can send me that. I'll send you some comments back too. I'm commenting on your
that's
comments.
where's the recovery and the recovering lawyer?
Exactly. But I have to say that it helped in the long run because it helped us narrow what we agreed on and what we disagreed on, so that we could then be
Right.
thinking about the third way, for the parts where we disagreed. So anyway, so I gave you that. I made more revisions to the manuscript after we had talked. I waited until we talked so I could be sure where I wanted to go, and then when I sent it back, I gave you a couple of pages with what I'd done. Here's what I've done. I made these changes. I took this out. I added this. Please focus on this when you look back at it. And so then you came back with 3 pages of comments and some additional track changes. And you even threw in a comment, I think you said, I'll try not to flog dead horses too much. And then you went back to something that I hadn't changed that you wanted to talk about again.
I never say I will not, I do not say I won't flog dead horses at all. Just try not to flog them too much.
Yeah. So I would say at the end of the day, we agreed on, 80% of things. And on 20%, we did some third ways. And there might've been 5% where I said, this is my book. I'm going to do it this way. And really,
fair enough.
That's pretty much how you tend to work with author. Now, if the author came back and said, I'm only going to agree about 5%, I'm going to do 9%, well, then you've probably got a problem working with that particular editor. But here's a couple of examples of what came out of this. And I can't get through all of them. We don't have the time. But Nora raised a good issue earlier on, a sensitivity issue about a name I'd used for a particular character. I hadn't thought much about it, but it was a Native American name, and it really didn't fit the narrative very much. So I changed the name, and it turns out I changed the name to something I really liked. It was one of the characters in the book named Lori, and I liked it because my dog was named Lori, and also Lori and Lonesome Dove, which is one of my favorite books. And so it had this sort of, when Chuck Yeager Alexander said Lori Darling, it kind of fit because he's kind of a Robert Duvall type, character that would fit that particular thing. So, and then this is one that I think I'm not going to try to put it up because I think it would be it might cut into our conversation, but I'll just talk about it. In the 3rd chapter, we meet the protagonist, Craig Travail. And when I sent that to you, Nora, originally, it started out, first of all, you said, here's your comment. I'm looking at it now. You said, I suggest beginning the chapter at a different point. Now, this is part of reorder, okay? Right? And the reason you're suggesting this is because I started off with this paragraph. After a life spent waging conflict, the graying trial lawyer, and of course I didn't even use his name here, had an acute feeling his career was about to find a resolution. The management committee of the AmLaw 100 law firm where he worked for 40 years and been a partner in for 33 demanded victories and profits and saw nothing of value in a well-fought contest that came up short, not even when the lawyer did it while dealing with the emotional burden of a family tragedy. Okay, all well and good. It's a little bit too much backstory to begin a paragraph. To begin a chapter, right? And you suggested I go down to what became the first paragraph, which was actually probably 6 or 7 paragraphs into that earlier draft. And this is how, and by the way, when I did this, Nora, and took your advice, I noticed that I could improve certain things, like let's get Craig Travail's name in there right up front. Not a gray-haired trial lawyer. Let's also have some active something going on right off the bat. So this is what the paragraph sounded like and sounds like now in the novel. Craig Travail ripped the envelope open, then gripped the court's ruling in one hand while he used the other to flick a soiled tobacco leaf from the page. It was from the Superior Court judge's office, and it smelled like chewing tobacco. Chief Judge Roscoe Chaw Brady must have sealed it himself. The county had a no smoking policy in public buildings, but Judge Brady found a loophole that led to his nickname and the installation of the gold-plated spittoon under his courtroom bench. Lawyers could measure their impact based on the spittoon's use. The judge spit when he didn't care for your argument, and Judge Chaw Brady spit often during Travail's argument in this case, the biggest case Travail had argued in 10 years. All right, you want to comment on the difference there, Nora?
We start with action, or we start with the character's name. And since this is the first time we're meeting him in the book, it's a good idea to get his name in there. And we're starting with action. And then even that bit of background or backstory about the judge is attention grabbing. It's different. It's active in its own way. And that suddenly you've got a judge with a spittoon under his desk. And you can tell when he's unhappy because ding, the spittoon is going to ring. So you've got sound, you've got feel. Let's see, that was a moist tobacco leaf, wasn't it? So you've got touch, you've got the aroma of the tobacco, you've got sight, and what am I missing? What would the missing sense be? Yeah, but I think you've got at least 4 senses in there, and maybe probably all 5, if I could remember what I've left out. So
Right.
I would say that's a strong opening.
And so what we did was, I told you before, there were like 6 or 7 paragraphs between that other opening and this little scene where he rips the envelope open. I cut that down to about 4 paragraphs. And the second paragraph, he's scanning the document. He's lost again. There's rain beating against the ceiling high window for the third paragraph. The extension on his phone rings. It's an unfriendly navigator. Boom, we need to talk. The phone slams on the other end. The law firm's principal is called Travail to his office. And then Travail had an acute feeling his career waging conflict was about to find a resolution at age 65. The AmLaw 100 law firm where he'd worked for 40 years, yada, yada, yada. So that fit well there after setting up the fact that he'd lost his biggest case in years. He'd been called to the office by the managing partner. And now we get a little bit of backstory, not much, but a little bit to tell you that he was about to lose his job in one of the biggest law firms in the Southeast. Now, that might sound like a little bit of a change and not a big change, but Nora, I think it made a huge difference in that particular
I
chapter.
think so. And I'm going to refer to my structure, my definition of structure again. What does the reader know and when do they need to know it? The reader needs to know faster who this person is, and they need to be drawn into the situation. And to draw them into the situation, you need some action, and you need to start conveying. The backstory can come; it does come, but you need to give them something really to hold on to quickly.
Right. Yeah, no, that was a great change. And then there were a couple others where we had a few little shifts in some chapters. By the time it got there, as I said, I'd had this sort of structure in mind, so we were working on other things. And you provided me with comments and track changes, many questions primarily. You weren't rewriting necessarily as much as you were you questioning particular provisions or saying, you know, you did this in 3 chapters ago. Now you're saying this. Does it fit? Or maybe does the reader need to know this sooner? Which there was an issue with whether or not a particular plot point, we didn't want to hold it too long. And when you're editing mysteries, Nora, we can't just spring something on the reader, on page 295 for the first time. They'll go, that's pretty unfair. We got to drop some hints and clues along the way, right?
Right.
Yeah. So we did that. We talked about the timeline, making it clear. We talked about, you had a lot of questions about the Mech deck, which made me, because the novel deals with the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which was good because you hadn't known anything much about it
Right.
before. And so that was part of the clarifying, and also part of not sticking too much history in what is a thriller, and I've told this in other places about how I used a technique that Megan Moran uses in one of her thrillers. I had her on the podcast, where to get some of that in without interrupting the narrative, I dropped these one-page paragraphs in throughout. Of course, you noticed that because I did it, but we had letters, we had like excerpts from conversations, and we had transcripts and that kind of thing, which was a way not to burden the dialogue and the narrative with too much history. Now, one of the areas, Nora, where we agreed partially and agreed wholeheartedly at times was direct versus indirect dialogue. And we had different examples of that. And the point's well taken that you're always pushing me to put more dialogue on the page in places if I'm not doing that, which is good. But there was an example where, and most of the time I just want to give an example where I pushed back, and this was where it was a courtroom scene. There was an example where you said you wanted dialogue, and the comment was, Elkin made a silly objection about the attorney-client privilege, but the judge rebuffed it. And my logic for not putting into Elkin's words, objection, judge, or something like that, attorney-client privilege, there'd been several other scenes where Elkin had spoken his objection out loud. And since the testimony that immediately followed this was pretty important, it was in direct testimony, I basically said, well, I'm going to pass on this one, but I take your point. And that was just an example. And then as you read plus I've noticed that John Grisham, who writes a lot of these courtroom scenes, a lot of times he will use indirect dialogue in a lot of places to where the actual testimony would be the kind that might bore the jury. And this is my idea of it might bore the reader if you put too much in direct dialogue. So that's just an example. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or what you want to say about that. Or...
Well, that particular thing, when to use indirect dialogue, which means sort of reporting on what was said rather than showing what was said, versus showing what is said. You almost always in a dialogue heavy book, in a courtroom scene is going to tend to be dialogue heavy. There will come a time when you need to condense or collapse some of that and do it as indirect dialogue. And I don't disagree with that at all. There's a little bit of a judgment call involved as to where those places are. So you can have two people, their judgment calls are different, but I think the guiding light has to be exactly what you just said. Are you going to bore the reader? And you don't want to do that. Elmore Leonard has 10 rules for writers, and they're all great. If you're a writer listening into this and you don't know Elmore Leonard's 10 rules, Google it. But one of them, I think it's number 10, is leave out the parts people tend to skip. So that's always, you're highlighting that challenge, Landis. And yeah, we may have disagreed on a specific, but I think we're in agreement that there definitely is a time to do it by indirection or collapsing information. And then there's a time to expand. And I'll say you write good dialogue. So I tended to want to see more of it.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I agree. It's hard. It's a judgment call. And for example, this other example where I had this character, Carrie Roberts, she's the gossip queen at the Indy. And she's the one when the judge called her down for hearsay. So the judge, look, if I didn't hear it, it didn't happen. So, she's that kind of person. And she has a lot of colorful dialogue where there's one scene where Terrell's trying to get her to the point, and I put it in indirect dialogue where it said something like, which she volunteered was because of her years of experience and well-deserved reputation as a gossip. She knew who was having sex with whom, who wanted to have sex with whom, and who preferred bridge to sex, which she said reminded her of a story. Travell cut her off with a relevant question. Now that indirect dialogue kind of keeps the pace moving,
Yes.
but it kind of gets it across as if you heard it in her own voice. So that's another example where indirect might do as well. We already talked about the Uptown Liberty Walk. Oh, dialogue tags. This is, and just so we're clear when we're talking about it, it's the he said or she said, and we're not talking now about she exclaimed or, she pined as she verbalized it or whatever. We're not talking about throwing the adjectives in. We're just talking about whether to use he said or she said with dialogue tags. And Nora, I know you pushed me at times to use more dialogue tags, and what it made me do, because I wanted to use less dialogue tags, was try to come up with a third way, which was to make sure when you read it again, you knew who was talking. And I took that from Craig Johnson, who writes with very few tags. Sometimes it can be confusing, but he kind of adheres to it, he said, because he likes for folks to get in the flow. And if you can set it up in a way that you know who's talking and you don't go on for a page, it's pretty easy to follow. And if you have 6 people in a scene, you're not going to get away with it, right? But, that was just another example. Now, the point is, you reminded me, I need a tag here. I looked at it and I said, oh, yeah, that's not clear. She can't tell who's saying that. So either I would put a tag in, he said or she said, not said he or said she. That's another thing you taught me. And every time I read a book now, it drives me crazy because all these best-selling authors out there making millions of dollars said he and said she. And you told me that's wrong. And of course, technically, it is, right?
Yeah.
But dialogue tags, your thoughts on those?
Yeah, the point is, I think you said it very well. The point is for the reader to always know who's talking. And I've had the experience with well-known writers, and you probably have too, where I had to go back and start counting on my fingers or scribbling in the margin. Okay, he spoke, she spoke, he spoke, she spoke, to providing my own tags to keep straight who said what. And maybe I'm too reactive to that. I want the reader to always know who spoke. And you're right. I agree. If there's a way to do it without using the tag, but still having it crystal clear. Let's go for that. Let's do that. And of course, then you look at the quality of the dialogue that a writer has put on the page. If the two voices are distinct enough,
right,
then it's easier. But if you have two, I'm making this up a little bit, but let's say you had two attorneys, each of whom is used to talking a lot. Those two attorneys could talk over each other to the point where the reader gets lost. So if you've got distinct enough voices and there are other little tricks you can figure out for yourself or notice in other people's writing, there are other little tricks you can use to make it more interesting and still have it clear.
And the tricks is exactly right. Because instead of saying, for example, tell me where you were on the night of the 15th, Travail said, you could say, Travail approached the lectern, looked up at the witness, and bore in on her. I'm using that's not very, and bore in on her. Tell me where you were on. You don't have to say he said or she said this because they know that what's following that is going to be Travail talking, which leads us before we talk about the worst thing and our tips to wrap this up to point of view. And we can't talk for long because you and I could talk for an hour on point of view because we
3 hours.
3 hours on point of view. But this is Nora. I will say that you push me hard in this area. And if I take away nothing else from this whole thing about point of view, and that is that when you begin a chapter, you begin a scene, at least ground your readers so they know whose point of view you are in if you're in third person close, because without that, the reader can become confused. Now, that's number one. And then number two is, should you have more than one point of view in a scene or a chapter? Now, I have tried to, following you, we tried to resist that, but I've been reading some books lately where they do a good job sometimes, but here's the thing, they make it clear when they make the transition. So for example, if you're in somebody's head up to a point, even without changing the scenes or changing another chapter, I was reading a book recently and they said after they'd been in one point of view, and then it said, and they were in the house examining something. And then it said, standing by the car, the detective took out his phone and texted someone. He had been trying to, so they shifted from the person's point of view who was looking at something in the house to the person standing by the car. But they did it in such a way that what followed from that was the detective standing by the car outside, and it was in their point of view. Now, had they jumped back and forth between those two, it'd have been really confusing. They didn't. They finished the chapter in that detective's outside point of view. But just to add to that, Nora, I think you've seen this, and it's called head hopping. You want to mention that before?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, head hopping is to make it sound extreme. If every other sentence, if this sentence is from Landis's point of view, and the next sentence is from my point of view, and the next sentence is Landis's, and the next one is mine, then you're hopping back and forth in and out of our heads too rapidly. And it's very tempting for a writer sometimes because it's easier. But I think it is a sign of a less experienced writer or a less sophisticated approach. And if you can, and writers do, if you can stay in Landis's head and still find a way to convey what Nora is feeling, then you're doing something much more sophisticated with point of view. And it's possible, and it's done.
It's done through dialogue. It's done through
dialogue, action, body language.
Right. But then there's also this question, and you would push on this too. Like if you're in somebody's point, I just remember this from one of the books, one of the Christmas books. Somebody's in the airport and somebody's walking up, and he says, and she approached with, 2 hot coffees for him, and you wrote something on there that says, "How does he know it's hot coffee?" And I'm like, "Oh, come on, Nora." He knows it, the reader knows it, you know it, I know it, but what you're doing is you're just trying to ground me in the fact, make sure that the person whose point of view you're in can know the circumstances, because they can't look through walls, they can't read people's minds, and if they start reading other people's minds, then that's a different kind of head hopping, right? So
Yes.
it's sort of staying true. It's sort of staying true to the point of view that you choose to tell your story in. And if you're choosing to tell it in first person, then unless you're a mind reader, you can't know what the other person's thinking except through their actions, their dialogue, and things of that nature. So anyway, like you said, we could talk for 3 hours on this, but let's do this. Give us a couple of thoughts about the developmental editing from the worst thing, and then we'll wrap up with some comments each of us has about working with editors.
Sure. Yes, thank you for that. Um, when the first time I had a full draft of the worst thing, I started out pretty well knowing what had to be true at the end of the book, but I wasn't entirely sure how to get there. So once I had a complete draft that took me all the way to that ending that I knew had to happen, I was ecstatic. And I was at a writer's retreat. Everybody else who was there at the retreat had gone down the street to go to dinner, and I stayed behind to pound out the last few pages. And when I finished, I at an unbecoming age for this, I skipped down the street because I was so happy. I was like a 5-year-old at Christmas because I had finished this. And when I came to the next morning and looked at it, I realized it was also 54,000 words, which is the length of a novella, not a full-length novel. This needed to be minimum 70,000 words. So that meant I had to increase it by 40%. That's a lot. And I had to do it in such a way that it was not just padded, and I couldn't just add fluff. I couldn't just stick words in there for the sake of it. I had to make this, I prize tight prose and not a lot of extra. So I had to find ways to expand that would be meaningful to the story and improve on the story. So I used my own formula. It's really the first time I used it myself: add, subtract, reorder, clarify. I started reading it. The first thing I discovered were things I should subtract. And that was scary because I'm trying to gain a net of, at least, well, say 20,000 words net gain. So when the first thing I'm doing is marking things for subtraction, that got a little scary. But I just stayed with the process. I also found some places where I could open up a scene and expand it, or where I had let my timeline jumped a couple of years, and I had not really said what happened during those intervening years. So I found a way to fill in those gaps. And I could do that. And in the end, I came up with about 74,000 words. So it worked. And I really felt that it was that formula I mentioned before. It gives you some objectivity to look at your own work. I found that to be very true from my own experience. And I found it to give me the good direction that I needed to get that manuscript where it needed to go. So I gave myself my own developmental editorial treatment. And I'm happy to say I was pleased with the results.
Yeah, and I think that's important. We talk about word count. I think it's readers want to hear a good story. I mean, so
Yeah.
There a lot of novels are getting shorter.
Yep.
There are even some traditional publishers publishing novellas now. Although you're right that a typical novel is somewhere between 70 and 110,000 words or something. My novel got up to about 119,000 words before it got to you, and I think I pared it down to about 98,000 when it got to you, and then in the end, the actual meat of the novel was around 88,000. Then we added the afterword of 30 pages, it got up to about 94,000. But for the novel itself, about 89,000 words. Now, to cut out those 25,000 words, I was actually cutting more and then adding back. So I probably cut 35,000 words to add back about 10 to get to the final of 89. So it's not just a simple matter of, okay, I've written 90,000, let's cut it down to 70, or I've written 54, let's add another 15,000. Like you said, you're going to have to cut stuff and add stuff, right, to get it to the word count. But ultimately, I do think maybe writers shouldn't get caught up too much in whether it's 85 or 90 or 95, as much as is the story moving? Is the pace good? Are the characters interesting? Do you have plot twists and reversals and things that keep people interested in the middle of the story? Because if you don't, it doesn't matter whether you write 40,000 words or 100,000 words. If people get bored at some point, they're going to stop reading, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's do this. We're going to wrap up here with some parting thoughts about, what both parties should do, and then I've got some thoughts as an author, and I'm gonna let you kind of summarize some thoughts maybe as an editor, and then we'll wrap it up. But I think we can all agree that both parties should going into this. I say this not just for the editor, but for the author too. Be clear on the compensation. Be clear on what you're being paid, what you're paying them to do, and what they're going to do for you, and be clear on like schedules and deadlines, right? That was one of the things you told me early on. I can't take your case. I can't take it right now, Landis, but I can take it, at the end of May. And so I knew that. And then we talked about, okay, what's your schedule after that? Because we, from our experience, we're going to work in maybe a couple of rounds here. So be clear on those things. And then I think too, you should, unless you've got a working relationship like Nora and I have, we know what our routine is. Be clear on what you want them to do, right? I mean, do you want a letter with notes? Do you want track changes with comments? Do you want both? Do you want them to comment more? Sometimes I've asked you, Nora, would you please look at this particular thing, in the
Hmm.
manuscript, focus on that.
Hmm.
It's kind of the same thing you do in a critique group. I don't need you to tell me about X as much as I need you to focus on Y, and then how many rounds are you going to do and that kind of thing. What are your thoughts about those items, Nora? I mean, because that's sort of the base going into it, right?
Yes, and I certainly think compensation, it's important for everybody to understand. Um, I think that schedule is important to try to
Right.
stick to. From my perspective, schedule is hard.
It is.
I and not because I don't want to stay on schedule. I always want to stay on schedule, but I say to writers, do it right, not fast. And I have to say to myself some days, do it right, not fast. That I know the writer is waiting. The writer wants my work back, and I want to get it to them. And maybe I've said I'll have it for you by the end of May, and maybe as it is May 24th, I can see it's going to take me till June 5th instead. So I try to communicate, try to let people know what to expect, because just expectations are important. It is helpful. It was very helpful to me, Landis, for you with our subsequent rounds of reading, for you to let me know areas you would like for me to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody does that. And I should probably be better about asking for that, because that lets me know how I can help you best. Then they're going to
just to interject an example there. Sorry to interrupt, but I had a chapter early in the book where there were about 7 people in the scene, and I was wondering, is this getting confusing? Am I being clear enough? And I wanted you to focus on that chapter to make sure that everything was clear in the clarity part of things. Sorry to interrupt, but I just
right. No, that's okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'd say, how many rounds will there be? I hardly ever know in advance how many rounds I'm going to feel we need.
Right.
And my approach is to kind of keep going until both the writer and I are satisfied.
Which gets to a point about scheduling for publication, because
yes,
a lot of times you think, well, I'm going to have this book out by a certain date, but sometimes the book isn't ready to be out
right,
by a certain date.
right.
So my advice is build some extra time in. For this book, Daily Declarations, I was experimenting with a lot of things. I learned my lesson in the first couple of books that just because you write it and publish it doesn't mean they will come, like in the Field of Dreams. You have to actually prepare for a release of a book. And so this time we built in, I think, 7 months after we knew that the book would have been copy edited and everything. So it was like, okay, I could have pushed, publish at any time, but we held off for 7 months to kind of prepare, which is a total another conversation about what we did in that 7 months. But anyway, okay, so that's the prep. I'm going to give some thoughts as an author, and then Nora, you're going to wrap up with some thoughts as an editor, is about how we can
Sure.
work with each other. So my thoughts are that before you get to the developmental editor, do some of the things we've talked about here. Add, subtract, reorder, and clarify. Try to get the structure of your novel in pretty good shape. How many acts are you going to have in the novel? Are you going to use the hero's journey, 3-act, 4-act, 5-act? What's it going to be? If you're writing a mystery, are you being fair to the reader? Throughout start thinking about these things before your developmental editor has to do it. What about the setting? Is it interesting? Is it rich? Is there something there? And then, does the protagonist have an arc? Does he or she change over the course of the novel? And also, are the goals of the characters clear to the reader up front? I mean, these are things I'm learning as I go, Nora, from interviewing all these people and from you. Do you have clear goals, and are there some good obstacles in the way for them? And as far as the villain goes, and this was true for you in the worst thing, they've got to be real. They've got to be complicated. They can't be a paper villain. They've got to be somebody that the readers may not like, but they understand. And that sort of came in. We didn't tell the backstory of the evildoer. I like to use the word evildoer in Deadly Declarations until much later in the novel. But by having that backstory, you're not going to like that person anymore, but you might understand a little bit more about what motivated them to do what they did. And then you got the plot kinks. Those things kind of take time to work out. I mean, if you got, and we had a number of different plot points in Deadly Declarations and 3 different things going on. So even Nora, I was even modifying some of that without your input through the process, because I was seeing things as we we're going back through the editing process, which is another value of working with someone. Are the words on the page clear? And as we talked about this, so the shifts in point of view well marked. When I'm reading the chapter or the scene, is it clear whose point of view it in? Talked about 5 senses, dialogue tags. Have you used enough direct dialogue for the character to speak? But here's some other important things. I think those are kind of the basics to get it ready. But once you've done that and you've shipped it off to the developmental editor and they give it back to you, don't take the comments personally. Find the parts. This is like any advice I give to people now when they ask me a question about writing. Take my advice with that proverbial cliche grain of salt. Use what works for you and discard what doesn't. So find the parts that work, and remember that the goal is to make make it better. So they're not giving you this advice because they don't like you or they think you're a terrible writer. They're giving you the advice because they want to help you make it better. And then don't feel obligated to accept every single suggestion, but listen clearly with an open mind, because there might be some things you disagree about. But and again, if you disagree with the developmental editor's feedback, be sure you have a good reason. And if you do, share it, because you might have misunderstood the point of the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And by sharing your feedback, like we did, I understood better maybe what I thought was the reason for the change was not the reason for the change. And when I knew the reason for the change, I go, okay, well, I see what she's getting at now. I can address it this way. Excuse me. And then I would say this too: if you're hoping that you're going to get back, an A+ on your theme, like in the Christmas Story where the little boy was looking for, support with A+, A+, A+. If you get that on the first response, you haven't hired a very good developmental editor. So Nora, I'm hoarse after going through that list, but you might have something to add to that. But as an editor, maybe some of your thoughts, and then we can wrap things up here.
And you know what, Landis, as I listened to you, it occurs to me we didn't really say something up front that we might have, and that is that I'm a freelance editor. Mm-hmm. So you have hired me, mm-hmm. And I would say any writer looking for any form of publication, what I believe about the publishing industry these days is the more polished your manuscript is before you take it to publication, or start looking for publication, the better off you're going to be. So look at hiring good freelance developmental editors and copy editors. So you're not giving somebody an excuse for rejecting it because it obviously hasn't been copy edited. So take it as you're hiring someone for what they know and what they can bring to your manuscript, what they can bring to your storytelling. So feel free to ask questions up front. Feel free to interview them. Feel free to ask what their approach is. I try to do that when someone first approaches me, a new writer first approaches me about possibly working with me. We'll talk. We often talk at length, and I try to explain my approach. And then I'll tell them to send me the first 25 pages. And I'll read and edit the first 25 pages and mark it up the way I do. Landis is very familiar with that. And I'm going to send it back to them because I think it does two things. It lets me see a sample of their work. And I may be the one who says, I don't really think I'm the right person for this project. But it will also give them a sample of my work. And they'll get to see, besides how I describe my process going on ad infinitum, they'll get to see it on the page, and they'll get to see how I'm going to what I'm going to deliver back to them. And then they may decide they want to look around more. And it's no harm, no foul. If we can't work together, if I can't bring value to the project, the faster we find that out, the better off we both are. So I'm very open to that. And I think developmental editors, by and large, are going to be very open to that because we all have just a limited amount of time. And we want to make the best use of that time we can, and we want to be of the best service we possibly can be. Mm-hmm. So don't be afraid to ask questions and to listen carefully to those answers, and then evaluate the situation. You're going to be working with this person for 6 or 8 months, maybe even come back to them with another project, maybe even 3 or 4 other projects, as Landis has. So, that to me is the best compliment anybody could give me, is to come back with another project. So assume that you are looking for a developmental editor with whom you feel you would have that relationship, and aim for that, aim high, and go from there and ask a lot of questions along the way. And if you get 6 double-space pages of comments, send them back 8 single-space pages of comments. It's okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think one of the things, an editor is not necessarily everything to everybody. You might not want to do a particular genre because you're more versed in suspense or mystery or thriller. Maybe science fiction is not your bag.
I would not. I don't think I would do science fiction. I've always said I wouldn't. I don't like apocalyptic stuff. I do a lot of dark stuff. I love and read and write and edit suspense and true crime and mystery, but I don't like to think about what's happened in the years after the bomb has gone off. I don't like post-apocalyptic stuff, so I don't want to do that. I don't think I would be very good at romance. I respect it, but it's not my thing. I don't think I would do a good job there. So ask a potential developmental editor where they feel their strengths are, what genres they're interested in, and find somebody who's really going to respond to what you're doing as a writer.
Yeah, that's all great. Well, look, we've been, Nora, going at it for over an hour now, and we could keep talking for a long time, and as we have when we've worked on projects together. But tell our audience where folks can find you, your website, both for your writing and editing.
My website as a writer is noragaskin.com. There is a listrabooks.com website where you would find, if you look there under the tab, Our Writers and Their Books, you'll see all the books I've published. Both look at that, both for finding good books that you're going to want to read. They're all available either online or through bookstores, and ebooks are also available. So look there to find a book you want to read and to get a sense of the range of things I've done. I'm on Facebook. There's a Listra Books page on Facebook, and there is a page that has the odd title Nora Tells Stories on Facebook. So look for those.
Yeah, that's great. And folks, you can find me at the at landiswade.com or at charlotterearspodcast.com. And I guess, Nora, I'm going to have to get busy writing, another book in this series here before too long, so we can
get busy.
Get to editing that. But I want to thank you, Nora, for sharing this. I'm sure down the road there could be some other things we could team up to talk about. But this is a very important part of the writing process, because without the help of a good developmental editor, someone other than the author's own brain, his or her own brain, you got to have a third-party perspective coming in to give you some feedback. And a good developmental editor like you does that. So thank you for helping me with my 4 books, and also for what you've done for others. And when can we expect another novel from Nora Gaskin?
We're aiming for 2023.
All right. Okay, good. Well, look, Nora, thanks a lot for sharing your knowledge, wisdom, and wit with us today. And we'll look forward to working with you some more.
Thank you, Landis.
All right, folks, thank you for joining us on this Charlotte Readers Live. And all the best to you. And I would say, stay cool out there. I guess it's going to be heating up soon, but have a great summer. And stay tuned for the podcast, too, because we're coming up on our 300th episode, June 21st. And we're going to be doing some things creatively after that. We're going to be calling it Beyond 300. I'll have some more information about that coming soon. So appreciate you being with us today. Take care.